Thanks for joining us today. We're going to jump right in. We have 45 minutes to cover a lot of ground. So we're going to graze above a bunch of information, pretty much at lightning speed. Many of you know us. I'm Shantia Anderhagen. My cohort is Arnold Robinson. We are both from Rhode Island, so we speak really fast, and we have a lot of information to share with you. So thank you for joining us. Couple of housekeeping things. You are all muted and invisible to us, although we do see names. There is going to be a Q&A at the end of our session to close it out. During the session, feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A option on the right side of your screen, and we'll cover as much as possible when we get to that point toward the end of the presentations. So I'm going to turn it over to Arnold. He's got a couple of polls for us to take before we start our presentation.
So we want to get a sense of who our audience is so we can tailor this as tightly as possible. So I'm going to launch 2 polls, and the first one that is out there, and Shanti, can you see it on the screen? Terrific.
Yes, I can.
So we're asking, what describes your role, our attendees' role in historic preservation and climate change? And it's multiple choice. You can click all that apply. So please click those and submit so we can see where you're all from. We'll get those results hopefully showing up on the screen. And Shanti, can you see results?
No.
No, I can.
I wonder if we have to do end poll.
We might have to. So let's give people a few more seconds.
They are showing up in the right-hand column.
Yeah, let's give folks a few more seconds to respond. And 3, 2, 1, ending that poll. And so I can see responses. So we've got about, can you see them, Shanti, on the screen at all?
Yes, yeah.
Terrific. So a lot of advocates, some design professionals, some folks concerned about their specific own properties, which is a good mix, gives us a sense. So the other one that I want, is the second one open yet? Shanti, can you see?
Yep, there, yep. You
Terrific.
just have to end, you want me to end it?
Yeah,
I ended it.
There's the voting, thank you.
Yep.
And so SLR, sea level rise, is what most folks are concerned about, increasing precipitation events. And high temperature days are the higher ones. So great, that gives us a sense of what you're interested in. And with that, Shanti, you can take it off.
All righty, just give me a second. It takes a second to launch our screens. Sorry. More time, I guess I have patience for. I'm going to keep my hands off everything for a minute.
And while Shanti's waiting, obviously, if you have questions that pop up during the session, we will be watching the Q&A section, but answering all questions at the end. But please feel free to start typing them as soon as we start going and you have a question.
So, facing down climate change, considering your cultural resources. Here's a quick rundown of what we are planning on covering, where we are, how to evaluate risks, what climate justice is, resources for planning and adaptation, sharing some successes, and then a quick Q&A. So there's no denying the existence of climate change. You can take all the federal government websites down and attempt to deny there's a problem, but the effects of climate change are clear, dramatic, and getting worse. So I set this session up by saying we're not going to debate whether this is a problem. The human-induced part of climate change is how we degrade our environment through things like deforestation and consuming fossil fuels in such vast quantities that the amount of carbon put into the atmosphere can no longer be managed by this beautiful planet's ecological systems. And there are serious consequences to climate change: environmental, health, social, and economic. And a few projections to consider. The New York Times recently stated that $500 billion of coastal real estate is expected to be underwater by the end of this century. Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Management Council, the CRMC, says that there will be a 9-foot increase in sea level rise by the same time, 2100. And by the way, Narragansett Bay has already risen 6 inches in the last 30 years. In the United States, climate migrants include more than 1 million people uprooted from the Gulf Coast by Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and nearly 200,000 people fleeing California's 2018 wildfires. Globally, the World Bank expects 143 million climate migrants by 2050. Here in Rhode Island, climate change generally shows up as a rising sea and as storm surges, coastal inundation that is now routinely seen at levels never seen before. We're having increasingly dramatic storm events with significantly more and harder precipitation. Clearly, that's shown in our poll. You all know that. The imposition of nature on historic building fabric and landscapes is inescapable. Again, to repeat, undeniable. So that's the bad news. The good news is that there has been helpful and attentive information coming out in Rhode Island. Over the past couple of years, there's been milestone work undertaken. In 2018, the state's Rhody Resilient Plan was issued. 2019, the City of Providence's Climate Justice Plan. 2020, the City of Newport issued its policy regarding elevating buildings. In 2014, then Director of the National Park Service, John Jarvis, issued Policy Memo 14-02, which many of us probably ignored unless we worked for the National Park Service. In it, Jarvis said, we must take a flexible approach to our management actions. Climate change does not alter our usual requirements, but it does challenge us to manage these resources in the best manner given uncertainty and sometimes rapidly changing conditions. So a key takeaway from Jarvis's 2014 memo is flexibility, and this remains true in 2021. We as preservation professionals and others charged with storing cultural resources into the future are going to have to adapt to solving the problems that climate change imposes on these resources in different ways than we have historically done. So how should we be approaching climate change in 2021? Well, it's becoming clear, holistically, collectively. We need to take a whole system, relational perspective. The work we do going forward will require inclusiveness and consideration of communities, housing, economic development, and to the greatest extent possible, sustainability. We need to approach our work and focus our efforts differently because of climate change. We must now all contribute significantly to the reduction of emissions. This means that when the opportunity to assess our energy use and type arises, we should select alternatives to fossil fuel consumption, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal. The decisions that we make about our systems, for example, just one example, will contribute to solving or perpetuating climate change. It's also now abundantly clear that developing resilience against climate change is dependent upon a significant amount of money, many partners, and local community input and action. And because the financial burden to address climate change is enormous, no one community will be able to go it alone. It's going to take help from local, state, and federal sources. After several years of denial, help is on the way. The United States has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. In the past couple of months, both Massachusetts and Rhode Island have enacted climate legislation. Rhode Island's law specifically identifies climate change as a threat to the state's tourism economy, and Massachusetts legislation specifically addresses environmental justice, something we'll get to in a minute. President Biden's January executive order, Tackling Climate Change at Home and Abroad, places climate change at the forefront of our national security and involves nearly all members of his cabinet. This action creates numerous federal entities to focus on a wide berth of climate-related tasks and initiatives. Moving on to evaluating risk. There are increasingly good models out there for how to assess climate change risks. In the short time we have today, I'm going to quickly run through some of the information that you should assemble to understand and strategize for the vulnerabilities that you're likely to face. The largest asset, I'm going to go back. Sorry, these slides were switched. The largest asset most people and organizations own is their real estate. And any uncertainty in real estate is a real problem. It impacts owners, insurers, municipalities, investors, lenders. Doing everything we can to eliminate that uncertainty is important. So assessing risk is a good idea. So where do you start? First, you need to assemble physical and legal facts about your resources. The year built, the year restored, your total square footage, number of stories of your building, surrounding topography and soil, material types and physical condition, your foundation, structural framing, siding. You need to identify and understand your lowest opening, lowest elevation, your lag, the lowest adjacent grade elevation, which identifies where the water surface elevation likely starts to damage your building. Understand your historic designations and the significance of your resource. And importantly, know your zoning. Next, you need to assess hazards. What are the known hazards and what are the likely and potential hazards? What do area maps and contextual history, for instance, perhaps oral histories, tell you about what your risks are? Depending on your location, the list can include natural disasters like earthquakes, flooding, hail, heavy snow, high winds, mudslides, lightning strikes. And then there's also surrounding activity to consider. Things that are going on around you that could be directly impacted, as well as things around you that may directly impact your resources. Power plants of all types, industrial and chemical plants, oil refineries, mines, military bases, dams. Next, you should know whether you're in a flood zone, and if so, what type. You need to understand FEMA's flood zone designation, velocity, stages. And if you are on the coast, you also need to know whether the land you're on is sinking along the sea around you rising. There are also economic and financial implications to measure. Gather information about the assessed value of your land and improvements, your buildings and structures. Know what your property taxes are. Know what you have or need for property and liability insurance. What type of coverage, especially flood insurance? What's your annual premium? What are your system's replacement costs? What about the loss of use? If you own a B&B on the water, what are these things going to cost you? And if you have collections in your care, they need to be considered too. The Smithsonian's climate change related risks and vulnerabilities is a pretty thoughtful list, and other organizations have well-established resources for disasters, which is obviously applicable because climate change really is a disaster. Finally, a thorough risk analysis would calculate your identified risks using a cost magnitude matrix. That is, what's the total financial cost to addressing your vulnerability? The city of Annapolis, Maryland developed an interesting matrix a few years ago that measures risk from very low, in other words, might cost you $5,000 to deal with your risk, to very high, over $100,000, with a very, very wide range in the medium risk category of $10,000 to $50,000. Many risk analysis models will assess the risks to the threats to buildings, properties, and landscapes, and perhaps collections. And while this is critically important to do, there are now a wider range of considerations to factor into your risk analysis process. In 2021, one of the considerations that we can no longer ignore is something that is increasingly being called climate justice. And it is something that we must now make part of all of the work we do with cultural resources. Climate justice is a subset of the environmental justice movement and focuses on equity issues specifically related to the climate. And environmental justice is really part of the larger issue of social justice. The EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. Further, it states that this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. The Massachusetts Vulnerability Preparedness Program identifies climate vulnerable populations as those who have lower adaptive capacity or higher exposure and sensitivity to climate hazards like flooding or heat stress due to factors such as access to transportation, and I might say no access to it, income, disability, racial inequity, health status, and age. A UN report on climate change stated that people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalized are especially vulnerable to climate change. And specifically, these are people of color, indigenous, low income, and women. Communities of color are far more likely to live near toxic facilities and to lack good medical care. They breathe in 40% more polluted air than white communities around the US. Seniors and the disabled and chronically ill will face more difficulties surviving periods of severe heat and won't be able to easily evacuate severe conditions like flooding. Our economically challenged population cannot afford flood or fire insurance, and in the face of forced displacement, cannot relocate to new housing. And their housing is often located in less desirable areas like floodplains, and their housing types are likely to suffer from mold without air conditioning to effectively combat severe heat or cope with strong storms. Immigrant communities often face language barriers which make it difficult to communicate early and effectively about severe weather and evacuation, for example. There are a good number of groups that are doing a lot of work on climate justice these days. Lots of them are starting to pay attention. The NAACP has been active in this arena for quite some time, and their Climate Justice Initiative Toolkit identifies 10 human and civil rights violations related to climate change. You see a few on the screen. So what's the world of cultural resource management and protection doing about climate justice? Well, for one thing, did you ever think you'd see an organization like Shelburne Farms offering a program about climate justice? Start Googling and you will be amazed at how many organizations are beginning to tackle this issue. Two colleagues who've taken a lead in discussing social justice and historic preservation are Jeremy Wells at the University of Maryland and Max Page at UMass Amherst. Wells has said, climate change will likely increase the inherent social justice issues in historic preservation practice because it reinforces expert rule, top-down decision-making, and marginalizes non-white perspectives. And he has asked, how do the white people, non-Latinx people, who dominate the fields of environmental conservation and historic preservation respectfully and consistently increase their engagement with non-white people, both in historic preservation and environmental conservation practice? In 2019, Dr. Andrea Roberts of Texas A&M University coined the phrase white gaze of historic preservation. That is, how we assess integrity and significance is based on an outdated system, one whose guidelines, and here's Wells again, quote, unintentionally favor the history and places of wealthy white people and have been adopted universally at every government level in the US. In other words, the focus on material integrity coupled with surviving historical records has resulted in excluding resources and places that lack those characteristics from our work. And those resources and places are predominantly those of minority communities. To address this, Wells has encouraged us to engage in broader and deeper discussions with groups that represent non-dominant perspectives, such as Latinos in heritage conservation and Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in historic preservation. The National Park Service and the National Trust for Historic Preservation have both become slightly more programmatically focused on issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion through publications, research, and focused initiatives. One example is the National Trust's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, a $25 million campaign launched in 2017 to support 150 historic places that have been overlooked in American history and represent centuries of African American activism, achievement, and resilience. Many of you probably recognize this slide of the Tangier Island in Chesapeake Bay, Maryland. I used to be concerned that the worst thing that could happen was the physical loss of cultural resources in the form of buildings, structures, and landscapes, primarily because that's the arena I work in. I now understand that we are at risk of losing much, much more than some buildings and perhaps a small neighborhood or two. We stand to lose important cultural connections to place, the loss of social fabric. Climate justice is teaching us that the conversation about sustainability goes well beyond buildings. It includes patterns of settlement and the humanities, including things like practices of storytelling, for example. Like our buildings and landscapes, we pass these cultural assets and institutions down to our descendants, and that's what creates a community's sense of place. And so, the choices we all make about how to act on climate change issues will have enormous impacts on poverty, inequality, distribution of environmental burdens and benefits, social and labor rights, healthcare, housing quality and affordability, education, labor, community, and so much more. These are things that we as cultural resources people have probably rarely had to consider, but that is changing and fast.
Is that my cue, Shanti?
Pardon me?
Is that my cue?
That's your cue. I'm sorry.
That's
yes.
Okay.
And up next is Arnold.
So I'm going to be focusing on the, as I get my slides up here, on sort of taking this broader context, taking this understanding of the issue, and saying how do Rhode Island communities make this adapt on their own as they hit the ground. Now, one of the things is I'm going to be going very fast as well, but what we've done is we've put together a PDF of a resource guide, which is much larger than the topics we will talk about. I've posted that on our session page that should be available. I'll double check that that's available for everybody, but essentially it's a 5-page PDF with all of these resources that we're talking about today. So you don't have to scribble notes. So my job is going to be talking about how are communities adapting now, and what can you as either a local, statewide advocate or regulator sort of do to make things state-of-the-art in your own communities for the things you're concerned about. So the space that I inhabit is assisting communities in adapting to climate change and a planning framework and a preservation framework. So one of the first things I'm always going to circle back to is the issue of a Rhode Island Community's Comprehensive Plan, which is the binding document for how growth can take place. Many communities have actively and expressly put in climate change as a part of different elements of their comprehensive plans, and you can find ways in which you can connect in that. So that's one major thing, is find the framework that you can tap into. One thing I don't think a lot of preservationists pay attention to is disaster planning and the getting ready for how does this work on a local level. So all communities are required to have a hazard mitigation plan. Many of those are being updated with grants and are constantly being updated. One of the things that many town planners have told me is that there is really not a whole lot of participation from the preservation and cultural resources communities when these hazard mitigation plans are put together. So I would urge you, A, to check your community's HMP, the hazard mitigation plan, find out if historic resources are expressly mentioned as a threatened resource from the named hazards that are there in this lower left-hand side. The community identifies its hazards and generally looks at critical infrastructure, but I think historic resources, archaeological resources need to be considered within the HMPs. Good communities are doing that, but they need voices at the table. Municipal resilience plans. Rhode Island, through the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, has the Municipal Resilience Program. And one of the things, this follows a model Massachusetts has been doing, which is having communities do local crowdsourced resilience planning. And so as of April 2021, on that right-hand side is a list of communities that have finished their local resilience planning, working with the Infrastructure Bank. And what you get out of those, and the other key of that is that there is another round coming up this year, and those communities on the lower left are participating in the program. And so, is your community on that list? Will they be doing it this year? If so, get involved. And if you've already done it, go read the Municipal Resilience Plan so you can see what's in it related to historic resources. But again, very few actually expressly call out protection of endangered historic resources because of climate change impacts. What does it look like when you look into one of those plans? And I do urge you to, it's a series of high priority actions. There's a broad statement of context and what's going on for climate change in the community, but you can find out what the community has planned for action. So high priority actions are listed, and you can see if you want to connect on any of those issues for protection of the resources you care about for historic. The other piece is that many local communities are taking action not only with government, but with allies. And so are there allied organizations within your community? In Barrington, one of the big movers has been the Barrington Farm School, which has been convening climate education and climate justice events in town. So interesting to find your allies and connect with them. You may have overlap with preservation issues. And the really good communities are actually empowering a local committee or a commission to be in charge of implementation or making things happen. So Barrington's a good example here. They actually have a resilience and energy committee that operates under the auspices of the town council. It's been appointed by. It advises the council on actions, and it actually having a sort of something within town government or city government makes a huge difference in things happening within your system. So in implementing anything on a hazard mitigation plan or a climate municipal resilience plan, who are the allies and where can you tap into the power structure? Another good example of Barrington is they're now doing neighborhood-based planning. And so there is a, you can take this from the town-wide down to the micro-wide. And so this is a neighborhood that has many historic or older structures in it, the Bay Spring neighborhood in Barrington, and you can do neighborhood-based planning, which has some preservation built into it. So these are the places you can tie in on your local level. There's other resources as well. But one of the things that I want to take to a micro level is what Shanti talked about, evaluating risk and to your historic resources. And right now it's sort of catch as catch can. And so one of the things that did get done, which is really impressive, was the State Preservation Commission working with Young and Associates doing a look at coastal communities and flood hazard, and what were those impacts from this one particular impact of climate change. And this report is available online. It's in our resource guide as well. The link to it is there. And it's a preliminary evaluation of impacts to historic resources. It sort of codes the GIS pieces from the state about where are their National Register or eligible resources and where are they within the impacts of flooding. So you can see a whole table across the state of how many buildings or historic resources are endangered. You can go to any one community and you can see mapping of which resources are endangered by particular types of storm events or climate change impacts. So this is a great place to go to take a look at some preliminary work, but only for coastal communities. A more dynamic tool that is being updated and you can use for coastal communities in Rhode Island is what's called Storm Tools. And this is put together by Rhode Island CRMC as part of their area management plans with strong collaboration with URI. You can go in and look at any property, any area of the state, and you can essentially look at what are those impacts coming from storm events and sea level rise, and you will be able to dynamically zoom in and see the impacts and essentially toggle what's going to happen with 1 foot of sea level rise, 2 foot of sea level rise, 100-year storm on top of that. And I chose Westerly, obviously a historic district. This is showing 2 feet of sea level rise, areas that will be inundated at high tides. And this is that same overlay with a 100-year storm event coming in on top of that. And you can sort of you can game out on these local levels what these impacts are going to be. Now this works great for coastal resources. I was talking to Teresa Crean from URI, and they're looking for funding to do a riverine version of this, so we can see what sort of riverine storm events are going to have as well. So we're hoping that's going to come to take place. One that is a little more out there in the world is called Flood Factor, and this is by the First Street Foundation, which is a large nonprofit that does data aggregation, and they have mapped the entire US for essentially flood impacts. And you can put in any address, residential properties only at this point, unless you have another version of this software, but the free version does all residential properties. You can plug in that address and it will show you what the particular flood threats are for that property, where it falls on a risk matrix, and it's highly dynamic. You can look at different scenarios for change in the future, and you can also look at the area around you and map out these areas of extreme risk. So there are some just sort of free tools out there available for communities to move from general hazard mitigation planning to assessing risk to their historic resources in the community. The last thing I want to talk about are what are communities doing to adapt to climate change impacts, which are coming faster and faster. And so there's a couple of key things I want to talk about, but I want to give you a theme, and it's unabashedly editorial about the preservation community. It prefaces how I look at these. I think that the preservation community has had the luxury of being very conservative for most of our history. And climate change impacts in those communities where there's going to be a physical danger to historic resources, I think totally flip that over. And adaptation is going to happen faster and is going to be driven by private owner decisions faster than we've ever seen before in these areas that are threatened by climate change impacts. And so in many ways, I think communities that are showing a willingness to adapt their historic resources are going to lose less historic resources. So I want to hit the sort of framework of possible responses local communities can take. One of the first ones is document, document, document. You are going to lose historic resources due to increased precipitation events, storm surges, increased wind velocity. It's just going to be happening. And that can be in the long term. But have we documented all the historic resources in Rhode Island, especially those in danger of storm impacts? And that means just beyond a survey form, right? That means getting to something where if you want to fully document or reconstruct the resource, do you have what you need to do that? So I think that's the first step good communities are doing is documentation. The second is that they are allowing adaptation through design. And we preservationists are a conservative lot. We don't necessarily like to see things change. And I want to hit on 4 things that communities are doing to allow adaptation. The first is elevation of structures. Second is allowing flood-proof design elements to be installed. Retreat, moving buildings out of harm's way. And then the overarching applicability of preservation regulations with the rest of regulatory structure. So good example, elevation of structures to get them away from the damaging effects of waves on their lower, more potentially weaker parts of their structure. This is an image from Charleston, South Carolina, which is kind of leading the way right now in elevation, allowing elevation of buildings, which private owners are doing. And in fact, it's where the next Keeping History Above Water conference is going to be in June, sort of highlighting that. But close to home, elevation has been a huge discussion in Newport and some other communities. And this is an example of an elevated house in one district in Newport. So elevation is one response. And do we allow that? Do we permit it to take place? Second is flood-proof design, allowing things like baffle walls in doorways, allowing flood-proof construction to go in over openings. That's one response that can also happen. Some communities are seeing floodproof design built into their retrofitting guidelines. This is Boston's retrofitting Boston buildings for flooding with suggested potential strategies with a historic building on its cover. In November of 19, the Park Service put out guidelines on flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. This is a word-only version. The graphic version is in production right now and should be coming out. And then retreat, moving those buildings out of the way. I go back to the fact that in the 18th and 19th centuries, moving buildings was common. We did it all the time. And now I think we sort of clutch our pearls at the idea of relocating buildings. But it's happening more and more in flood zones, and especially in relation to particularly landmark buildings that might need to go to a new location. I was very interested to also see in terms of what I would call the ultimate retreat, that last night there was a coastal homeowner buyout forum in Barnstable. And I got a chance to listen to some of those discussions. And that more and more, I think you're going to see towns, as they deal with flood insurance issues, offering buyout programs to move. And those will include historic communities. Broader regulations, many communities are now adapting system-wide regulations for flood mitigation. So Baltimore and their Landmarks Commission has a fantastic historical and preservation set of flood mitigation guidelines for the low-lying Fells Point neighborhood. New Jersey has issued statewide guidelines for elevating buildings on the lower left. And in Newport, the Newport Historic District Commission, after seeing several applications for elevation, decided to put together elevation guidelines. So instead of saying we're going to hear this on a case-by-case basis every time, well, they still hear the cases, there's guidelines for if you are proposing to elevate your historic building in Newport, here is the set of guidelines we want you to follow as you do this. And I was chatting with Helen Johnson, the preservation planner, who's saying that they've now seen about 9 or 10 applications through these guidelines coming through. So it is increasing in frequency. Charleston has a well-established set of guidelines for elevation. Those are out there. Boston has put together its Resilient Historic Buildings Design Guide, which includes many types of response. And I think one of the most thoughtful things that has been happening over the last year, Nantucket has been doing a terrific job convening a public discussion with their Historic District Commission, their preservation organizations, their hazard mitigation and climate adaptation staff, and the different commissions to really philosophically think through how Nantucket is going to adapt to increasingly frequent storm events and sea level rise and erosion taking place on the island. And so they have what's called an MVP action grant to convene a series of public discussions. So rather than just adopting a guideline and then saying let the chips fall where they may, they've really been thinking about how to do this thoughtfully. I think this is going to be a model for more communities who need to adapt to climate change impacts. So that's been great. And actually, starting at 12 today is one of their open forums for designing for adaptation. So that will start right after our session. And finally, funding sources. Nothing happens without money. And there is a shift taking place, I think, within funding to increase the funding for adaptation. So always consult with your state resilience programs, and that's Resilient Rhode within the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank here. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management, would always rather get ahead of disasters. They have a great series of pre-disaster mitigation planning grants. There's coastal resource funding that can be used for localized planning to do adaptation planning. And I think we're going to see this baked into the federal infrastructure funding that's coming through the federal government. So with that, that sort of wraps up the quick and dirty version. I do want to say, as I'll exit out of this so we can talk with any questions. But one of the things is that the PDF people aren't finding yet on the site. We've posted that. But one thing we can do is I'm going to post my email address in the chat. And if folks want to send me a request for a link, I'm happy to send the PDF. It's not a huge document. So with that, Shanti, that's the end of my part.
Great. Well, thanks, Arnold. We currently don't have any questions and answers in our question and answer portal, but I certainly would encourage people to dump them in. If you have them. We covered a lot of ground really fast. I can't imagine that there isn't something that we need to address. So let's see, it looks like we have one. Let me see what this one is. We're being asked, are you aware of any discussions of relocating entire historic neighborhoods together in the interest of trying to retain social fabric? Arnold.
Yeah, that has happened. I have not seen it happen on the East Coast. I have seen some good case studies from the Mississippi and Missouri river valleys with frequent river flooding. One of the things that has happened is the feds have been much more aggressive about relocating whole towns out of flood zones in those areas, and several communities did band together as part of that process to sort of say we want to stay together in the same neighborhood. So I think that's the social side of the question, Cody. I don't know to what degree they were also physically successful in moving structures. At that point, it was about families who'd been together for a long time and wanted to stay in neighborhoods that were together. But I don't know if the buildings accompanied them. But I can take a look and see if there's any writings on that. I have seen 2 documentaries related to that.
Let's see, we have another one. Just give me a second to pull it up. Can you say a word or two about retreating from the coastline?
The community that I know that is going fastest on this right now is North Carolina. There's several legal issues that have taken place that have driven this. There's a lot of buyout program things that have taken place. There was a really interesting discussion that a North Carolina town had that's still in court, by the way, where the town had replaced a road that had washed out to service several beachfront properties, almost a neighborhood, 4 times. And at the end of it, the town said, we're done. We can't do this anymore without breaking our budget. And your right to get to your property, which is threatened by sea level rise, is not our job. And the owners obviously sued and said, no, part of us paying property taxes is that we get to keep our roads and our infrastructure, and we get to stay right where we are. And that is in court. And I think that's going to be one of many cases we're seeing going to courts that are going to establish what those rules are for the supportive role of government, the sort of intervention of wholesale retreat, and how that takes place. The most I see right now are communities that are discussing using federal disaster funds to do preemptive buyouts of areas that are simply going to disappear in a short term. That science can sort of say, no, this area is going to wash away, be impacted by standard storm events. It's just not worth keeping it there anymore or paying claims for disaster.
We have a comment that says, including historic properties in the HMPs can also help when applying for FEMA grants to enact any protective measures that are recommended to protect them. Do you want to comment on that, Arnold?
No, that's absolutely right. In fact, I would say that at any level, you can build historic resource preservation and climate change adaptation together into your comprehensive plan, your hazard mitigation plan, your local resilience plan, your flood management guidelines, everything. The easier it then is to go for funding, and the easier it is if there's a disaster to seek funding to support restoration because you've had it baked into your process. That's absolutely right.
And how about this? Should historic preservation programs use more aggressive climate change models? Are the planning strategies too conservative?
This is where my advice to communities, I work in a firm of scientists and climate engineers, and we go from the federal models, and it was interesting to see only a couple of years ago that NOAA switched from a prior model that had been a somewhat moderate model to what's now called the high curve. And so when NOAA changes the forecast, that to all of us should say this has the highest probability of taking place. But I do think in a way it's a good question. But if we're going to be credible going out to the world and being advocates for adaptation, I don't think we can have our own forecasts. I think we need to rely on a agency or a set of data that is very defensible. So for me, I always go to NOAA as the federal agency that does the best predictions, and the state agencies that then use that data to make localized predictions. But right now, it is fairly aggressive if you go look at the NOAA high curve and what it predicts for sea level rise rates in the coming years.
Can you relate the issue of open or preserved spaces to climate justice?
You want to take that?
Go. No, I want to hear what you're going to say, Arnold.
Well, so I'm working with a couple of clients right now in Massachusetts who are absolutely doing that. The access to open space, the access to flood storage capacity, the access to the cooling effect of trees and green landscape within communities has long been something that has been a part of not having an equitable sort of community for climate. And so I'm very much seeing communities who are saying that having universally accessible open space or a functioning ecosystem, because that can be different in cities sometimes, is absolutely a base right, and we should be doing that across all communities rather than only having it in the ones that can afford the extra space.
Well, I don't see any other questions. This is kind of the last call for any other questions that anybody has. Any other comments, Arnold, before we wrap up?
No, I think that the one thing that is most interesting about this is that go make a difference at your local community level. We've got a state sort of climate adaptation plan, and I'm struck by researching for this talk and work for my clients how few communities I see building historic resource protection into their climate adaptation. It's very hit or miss. If it's your HDC or a planning board member is into it, it takes place. But I think that's a really important thing to build in at the local level.
Right, and we have one resource that was shared in the Q&A. I don't know if everybody can see Q&A, so I would ask the person who shared the climate modeling resource to throw it into the chat. The umass.edu reference should really go in the chat so everybody can see it, because I don't know if everybody can see what we can see on the Q&A. And I think with that, we are right about at time. We'll get cut off dramatically if we don't wrap up in another minute or two. I'd like to really thank Arnold for being game to do this and providing so much information, and we will figure out how to identify where the PDF is for you. And Anarita for helping us supporting our session. She is the GIS specialist at the State Preservation Office, so work is underway there, and I know she's interested in bringing some climate change information into her work. So much appreciated, Anarita. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.